New York City, 1951. A concrete curb on 42nd Street near Times Square where the noise of the city pressed down like weather. Two young men sat beside each other on that curb, both struggling, both unknown, both invisible to the thousands of people walking past. James Dean was 20 years old. He had exactly $3 in his pocket. The other actor had less. They sat and talked for 2 hours about doubt, about failure, about the question that haunts every person who has ever wanted something they weren't sure they could have. Should I keep trying, or should I go home? By the time they stood up, something had shifted in the street around them. People had stopped moving. People had gathered. By the end of that afternoon, 500 people stood watching two young men on a curb. The question nobody has fully understood since is this: what had James Dean actually done to create that moment? James Dean arrived in New York in the spring of 1951 with very little money and even less certainty about what he was going to do with his life. He had come to study acting at the Lee Strasberg Theater and Film Institute. He had a scholarship. Someone had seen potential in him. But potential and reality are not the same thing. Potential is a promise. Reality is an audition where you wait in a hallway with 40 other people who look like you, who want the same thing, who are all equally desperate. He had been in New York for several months. He had gone to auditions. He had failed them. He had worked as a busboy. He had slept in a room so small that he could almost touch both walls if he stretched out his arms. He was 19 years old, and he was beginning to understand something that most people learn much later, that wanting something very badly does not guarantee that you will get it. This is a story about a moment when James Dean was at his most powerless, before the studios noticed him, before the success, before the image, before any of it. It's a story about what he did when he had nothing to offer except his attention, his time, and his willingness to sit with someone else who was also struggling. And somehow, that was enough to change something in the street around him, enough to make 500 strangers stop and listen, enough to suggest that there was something in James Dean's honesty that people were desperate to hear. The curb was on 42nd Street, near the corner of Broadway, in the heart of what was then called the Theater District. Above, the marquees flickered with the names of shows and actors who had made it, who had been chosen. The lights were bright and constant, a promise of something that seemed within reach but also infinitely far away. Below, on the street level, the curb was just concrete, worn smooth by years of feet, stained with the residue of 1,000 lunches eaten by people waiting for something better. This was where the invisible gathered, where you could sit and watch the world move past and pretend you were part of it. James Dean was sitting on the curb with a cup of coffee that was cooling in his hand. The coffee was not good. The coffee in New York in 1951, if you were poor, was rarely good. It was hot, which was something. It was cheap, which mattered. He wasn't there by accident. He came to this spot regularly. It was a place where actors congregated when they couldn't afford to sit inside a diner or a coffee shop. A place where you could be in the city but not of it. The other actor's name was Michael. James Dean had met him a few weeks earlier at an audition they had both failed. Michael was from Ohio. He had come to New York with even less money than James Dean, which was saying something. He was thinner. He looked hungrier. The kind of thin that suggests you're not eating regularly, that you're choosing between meals and rent and there's no winning combination. The kind of thin that means you're running out of time. Michael had told James Dean that morning that he was thinking about going home, that he was tired, that the auditions weren't going anywhere, that maybe he wasn't meant to do this, that maybe the people who said acting was a waste of time had been right all along. This was not an unusual conversation in New York in 1951. Hundreds of young people had this conversation every day. The difference was that James Dean had listened, really listened, not with the distracted ear of someone doing you a favor, but with the full attention of someone who understood what it meant to be doubtful, who had felt it himself, who knew what the weight of it felt like. So when Michael said he was thinking about leaving, James Dean had said, "Sit with me for a while. Let's talk about it." They had found this curb. They had sat down. The afternoon was moving toward evening. The light was changing in that particular way that happens in New York in the spring, when the sun hits the buildings at an angle that makes everything look like it's been dipped in gold. The light that makes the city look like it's full of possibility. People were walking past them, thousands of people. No one was paying attention to two young men sitting on a curb talking about disappointment and doubt. No one knew their names. No one cared. To understand why James Dean was sitting on a curb listening to Michael's doubts, why he had chosen to spend an afternoon on 42nd Street instead of at an audition or at work, you have to understand what was happening inside James Dean at that exact moment in his life. He had arrived in New York with more than just a scholarship. He had arrived with a specific wound. His mother had died when he was 9 years old. That loss had shaped him in ways he was still discovering. It had taught him that safety is an illusion. It had taught him that the things that matter most can be taken away without warning. And it had taught him something else, that the only logical response to that knowledge is to do the things that matter to you right now while you still can. But there was more to it than that. In New York, in those early months, James Dean had discovered something about himself that surprised him. He had discovered that he had a capacity for empathy that went beyond what most people expected of him. He could see the struggle in another person. He could recognize the moment when someone was about to give up, and he could sit with that moment without trying to fix it or minimize it or turn it into a lesson. This was not a common skill. Most people, when confronted with someone else's doubt, either try to encourage them out of it or judge them for feeling it. They offer advice. They try to motivate. They turn the conversation into something about themselves, about how they have overcome similar obstacles, about how they have persevered. James Dean didn't do that. He sat with the doubt. He acknowledged it. He treated it as legitimate. In those months in New York, James Dean had also learned what it meant to be powerless. He was 19 years old. He had no money. He had no connections. He had no ability to make anything happen. He was subject to the decisions of audition directors and casting agents and producers. His fate was in the hands of people who didn't know him, who made snap judgments based on how he looked, how he read, how he performed under pressure. And in that powerlessness, he had discovered something important. He had discovered that there were other forms of power, the power to listen, the power to be present, the power to sit with another human being in their struggle and make them feel less alone. Michael had $3. James Dean had $3. They were sitting on a curb made of concrete and time. They had nothing to offer each other materially. But what James Dean was offering Michael was something that money couldn't buy. He was offering his full attention. He was offering the belief that Michael's struggle was not a sign of weakness, that his doubt was not a character flaw, that there was value in simply showing up and trying even when the odds were against him. This was not a small thing. In a city of 8 million people, in a profession built on rejection and competition, in a moment when everything about the structure of the world suggested that Michael should go home and accept defeat, James Dean was saying something different. He was saying, I see you. I understand what you're feeling, and I believe that it matters that you're here. They had been sitting on the curb for about an hour when the light began to change. Not just the light in the sky, though that was changing too. The light around them, the quality of the air, something shifted in the attention of the people moving past. James Dean was talking about his mother. He had never planned to talk about this. It wasn't something he discussed regularly, but Michael had asked him a direct question. How do you keep going when everything feels impossible? And James Dean had decided to answer it honestly. He talked about how his mother had died when he was 9 years old. He talked about what it felt like to lose someone and never have the chance to say goodbye, never have the chance to understand who they were outside of what they meant to you. He talked about how that loss had shaped his entire understanding of time and risk and what it meant to want something. He wasn't giving Michael a pep talk. He wasn't performing inspiration or motivation. He was simply being honest. He was saying, I understand doubt because I have felt it. I understand the desire to give up because I have considered it. I understand why you might want to go home, but I also understand why you can't." Michael was listening. His face had changed. The tension in his shoulders had softened. He was being seen, and being seen made all the difference. But something else was happening around them. A woman had stopped walking. She stood nearby, pretending to tie her shoe, but she was listening. Then a man stopped. He didn't pretend to do anything. He just stopped and listened. Then another woman, then a teenager, then someone else. People were drawn in, not because James Dean was famous, not because they recognized him, but because they heard something in his voice that was different from the noise of the city, something that suggested he was not performing. He was being real in a place built on performance. By the time James Dean had finished talking about his mother and what it meant to understand that safety is an illusion, there were 15 people gathered around them on the sidewalk. 20. 30. The police started to notice. There were so many people gathered now that they were creating an obstruction on the sidewalk, disrupting the flow of foot traffic. But still, no one was moving. James Dean continued. He talked about failure. He talked about auditions where he had felt invisible. He talked about the moment when he had almost decided to go back to Indiana and accept that this dream wasn't going to happen. And he talked about what had made him decide to stay. The crowd continued to grow. 40 people, 50, 100. The afternoon was turning into evening, and still people were coming. Still people were stopping, drawn by something they couldn't quite name. Maybe it was the quality of his voice. Maybe it was the honesty in what he was saying. Maybe it was simply that in a city where everyone is performing all the time, where everyone is trying to be someone they're not, here was someone being exactly who he was. People were crying. Not dramatic crying, but tears sliding down faces. A woman was holding a notebook, writing down what he was saying. A man had his arm around another man, both of them listening with complete attention. Michael was looking at James Dean with an expression of shock and gratitude. He had come to sit on a curb thinking about leaving the city, thinking about defeat, and instead he had found someone who understood exactly what he was feeling. Someone who had felt it too. Someone who had decided to stay anyway. One of the police officers approached. His expression was not hostile, just confused. "You need to move along," he said. James Dean stopped talking. He looked around at the faces. Mostly young people, mostly struggling. The kind of people who recognized something in his honesty that they needed to hear. The kind of people who were tired of performing, tired of hiding, tired of pretending they had it figured out. He stood up. Michael stood up beside him. They gathered their empty coffee cups, their nothing. The crowd began to disperse, slowly, reluctant to break the spell that had been created on a curb on 42nd Street. As they walked away, people were calling after them. "Thank you," someone said. "You helped me," someone else said. A woman was crying openly now, making no attempt to hide it. By the time James Dean and Michael had turned the corner, the police estimated that there had been over 500 people gathered on that curb. 500 strangers who had stopped moving, stopped performing, stopped trying to get somewhere else, and had instead listened to a 19-year-old who had nothing to offer but the truth. This was not the first time something like this had happened, though this was the most dramatic, and it would not be the last. In the weeks and months that followed, word spread through the struggling artist community in New York. There was a young actor named James Dean who would sit with you, who would listen, who understood what it meant to doubt yourself and keep trying anyway, who treated your struggle as though it mattered. People began seeking him out, not because he was famous, not because he could help them in any material way. He couldn't. He was as poor as they were, but because they had heard that he was real, that he wouldn't offer you false hope or platitudes, that he wouldn't try to motivate you or fix you, that he would sit with you in your struggle and treat it as legitimate. There's an actor named David Ramirez who spent an evening with James Dean in a diner in 1952. David was preparing to move back home, to give up on acting entirely. His family had been calling. They wanted him to stop this nonsense and get a real job. James Dean didn't try to convince him to stay. Instead, he asked David questions about why he had wanted to act in the first place. They talked for hours. James Dean ordered food he couldn't afford so David would have something to eat. At the end of the conversation, David made a different choice. He decided to stay, not because James Dean had convinced him to, but because James Dean had helped him understand what he actually wanted beneath the fear and the doubt. There's a stage director named Alina Wong who encountered James Dean at an audition she was conducting. He had failed the audition, but afterward he waited. He wanted to know what he had done wrong, not out of defensiveness, but out of genuine curiosity about how to improve. Alina was struck by his humility, by his willingness to hear criticism, by his understanding that failure was information, not rejection. They talked for 40 minutes after the other auditions were finished. James Dean asked Alina questions about what she was looking for, about her vision for the production, about why certain choices mattered to her. Alina found herself talking about things she had never discussed with anyone before, about her doubts, about whether she was good enough to be a director, about the fear that she was going to fail. By the end of the conversation, Alina had hired James Dean for a small role in an off-Broadway production, not because he was the most talented auditioner, but because in talking with him, she had felt something shift in herself. She had felt seen, and that feeling made her want to work with him. What's consistent in all of these stories is this: James Dean treated other struggling artists as though they mattered, not as competition, not as background characters in his own story, but as people with legitimate struggles and legitimate dreams, people whose doubt was understandable, people whose fear was reasonable, people who deserved to be witnessed. This was unusual. Even in 1951, before he was famous, there was something about James Dean that made people want to be around him. It wasn't charm in the conventional sense. It wasn't charisma that you could bottle and sell. It was something closer to authenticity. He wasn't performing interest. He wasn't performing empathy. He was actually interested. He actually cared. He actually believed that other people's struggles mattered. And people felt that. They felt seen by him in a way they rarely felt seen by anyone else. When James Dean eventually became famous, when the studios began to control his image, when the machinery of Hollywood began to shape him into something marketable, he maintained this quality. It became harder to access, perhaps. The fame created distance. The business of being famous made it difficult to sit on curbs and listen to struggling actors, but the capacity for it never entirely disappeared. He never entirely forgot what it felt like to be the person sitting on the curb in New York, unsure if he was going to make it, needing someone to sit with him and say, "I understand. Your struggle matters. You are not alone." That curb on 42nd Street became legendary in a certain community. Years later, long after James Dean was dead, people would still talk about it. About the day that 500 people gathered around a young man who was just being honest. About the day that authenticity created a moment of connection that transcended the usual rules of the city. It was not a calculated moment. James Dean had not set out to create a crowd. He had simply decided to sit with a friend in his doubt and be honest about his own pain. And in doing so, he had created something that the city needed. A moment of real connection in a place where most connections are performed. The 500 people who gathered on that curb on 42nd Street in 1951 were not gathering because James Dean was famous. He wasn't. They were not gathering because they had seen him in a film or read about him in a magazine. They were gathering because something in the way he was speaking, something in his honesty, his vulnerability, his willingness to talk about his own pain without apology or performance, resonated with them in a way that most of human communication does not. In a city of 8 million people, each person is essentially alone. You move through the streets surrounded by bodies, but each person is inside their own struggle, their own doubt, their own fear. The masks we wear are designed to protect us from being truly seen, and yet all of us are desperate to be seen. All of us want to believe that our struggle is not unique, that our doubt is shared, that somewhere in this city of 8 million people, there is someone who understands what we are feeling. James Dean, sitting on that curb, removed his mask. He talked about his mother's death. He talked about his doubt. He talked about his own struggle to figure out who he was and what he was going to do with his life. He did this not to perform vulnerability, not to create an effect, but because it was true. Because in that moment, with Michael sitting beside him, the truth was the only thing that mattered. And in doing so, he gave other people permission to be seen, to acknowledge their own struggle, to stop pretending that they had it figured out, to stop performing confidence and start being honest about fear. This is what the public image of James Dean never quite captured. The photographs show a beautiful young man. The films show a talented actor. The legend shows a rebel who burned too bright and was taken away too soon. The mythology focuses on the tragedy, on the waste of potential, on the questions about what he might have become if he had lived longer. But the person on that curb on 42nd Street was something different. He was someone who understood that the greatest gift you can give another human being is your presence, your full attention, your willingness to sit with them in their doubt and not try to fix it or minimize it or use it as an opportunity to talk about yourself. He was someone who understood that what people need, more than advice or inspiration or motivation, is to feel less alone. He was someone who understood that fame is temporary, that beauty fades, that talent can be taken away, that success can be fleeting, but the impact you have on another person, the moment when you see them and they feel seen, that lasts. That stays with them. That shapes how they understand themselves and their place in the world. The 500 people who gathered that afternoon probably didn't remember his name. Some of them probably never knew it, but they remembered the feeling. They remembered what it was like to be a stranger in a city, struggling and alone and invisible, and then to suddenly feel seen by another human being. Seen not for what they had accomplished, not for how they looked, not for anything external, but for their struggle itself, for their humanity, for the fact that they were trying. That was the real James Dean, not the actor, not the rebel, not the beautiful young man who would soon be discovered by the studios and shaped into an image. Just a young man on a curb giving away the only thing he had to give, himself, his attention, his honesty, his belief that other people's struggles mattered. In that moment, he was more powerful than he would ever be as a famous actor, because his power came not from his fame, but from his authenticity, not from his image, but from his willingness to be real. Michael, the actor James Dean sat with on that curb, did not become famous. He never had a significant career in acting. He eventually moved back to Ohio, got a job working in construction, and lived a quiet life. But he carried that afternoon with him for the rest of his life. In interviews decades later, when asked about his decision to leave acting, he would mention James Dean. He would talk about what it meant to have someone sit with him in his doubt and treat his struggle as legitimate. He would talk about how that conversation had changed the way he understood himself. He never became an actor, but he became a person who knew what it meant to be seen, and that changed everything. This is what that moment on 42nd Street was actually about. Not about creating a crowd, not about demonstrating James Dean's power or magnetism or charisma. It was about a young man who understood that other people's struggles matter, that loneliness is a universal human experience, that sometimes what people need is not advice or help or inspiration, but simply to be witnessed, to have someone sit with them and say, "I understand. Your struggle is real. You are not alone." What this story reveals about James Dean is not flattering in conventional ways. It doesn't make him larger or more impressive or more heroic. If anything, it makes him smaller, more human, more recognizable. It tells us that the person the world would eventually mourn as an icon was actually deeply committed to something far more simple and far more difficult, to paying attention to people who were being overlooked by the world. In a city of 8 million people, he had chosen to sit with one struggling actor and give him his complete attention. In doing so, He had created a moment that rippled outward, that touched hundreds of people, that changed something in the street around him. Not through force or manipulation or charisma, but through honesty, through presence, through the simple act of being real. Not because he was James Dean the actor, not because he would eventually become famous and people would want to claim they had been there, but because he was a human being who understood what it meant to be unseen and had the courage to be fully present for another person. And in doing so, he created a moment where 500 strangers felt, for a brief afternoon, that they were not alone. That is a form of power that has nothing to do with fame, and it lasts long after fame has faded away. Here's what I want to ask you. Have you ever had a moment when someone sat with you in your doubt, not to fix it or minimize it, but just to witness it, and it changed how you understood yourself? What did that moment teach you about what we actually need from each other? Tell me in the comments. I'm reading everyone. If you believe these untold stories matter, the quiet moments that reveal real character, the small acts of presence and attention that never make the headlines but change everything, subscribe to this channel. We're telling the human stories behind the legends. Stories that remind us that the most important things about a person are often the things the world never sees. Stories that show us what it actually means to be real. Next, I want to tell you about the night James Dean was supposed to walk away from acting entirely, about the one conversation that made him decide to stay, and what that conversation reveals about what he actually believed his life should be for.